I know this will make me look weak, maybe even pathetic, but I need to tell it exactly how it happened. If you only want heroes, stop here. I wasn't one. I was the guy who kept giving second chances because I believed that was what love required. We met in the most ordinary way, a friend's small gathering, music too low, everyone pretending to know each other better than they did. She made eye contact like a dare. The first thing she said to me was, "Don't bore me." I laughed because I thought it was a joke. It was not a joke. It was a rule. From the start she set the tempo and I ran to keep up. She picked a restaurant, ordered for both of us, corrected the waiter like she was fixing a typo in the night. I told myself it was charm. People like to call confidence red flags when they're scared of it. That's what I told my friends. The truth is I liked hiding behind someone who spoke loudly enough for two. She had a way of making everything feel cinematic. She'd text, "Come outside," and I'd find her leaning against a car she didn't own, hair pinned up like she'd been blown in by the weather. Once she dragged me to a midnight photo booth and said, "Let's look like we know what we're doing." We didn't. But the strip of pictures made it seem like we did, and sometimes the appearance is enough to carry you for weeks. There were signs, I guess. Little delays that didn't fit the story we were selling. She was always almost somewhere. Almost done with work. Almost on her way. Almost ready to call. When I'd ask, she'd say, "You're too precise," as if punctuality were a character flaw. When she was present, she was so present you forgot anything could exist outside that room. When she was gone, the absence rattled the windows. I learned her habits like a language I wanted to be fluent in. She needed attention like plants need light, which would be fine if I were a sun. I'm not. I'm more like a lamp you switch on when you get home. She said she loved that about me, that I was steady. Then she'd add, "Steady can be boring, the way people mention rain after a good day." I laughed along. Laughter is a good eraser in the moment. It doesn't do much for what's underneath. My friends liked her first. She knew exactly how to be liked, she made it look easy. She remembered birthdays that weren't hers, gave loud compliments that sounded like gifts. One of my closest friends pulled me aside and said, "She's electric, man. Don't mess this up." I nodded like someone receiving instructions. I was already trying not to mess it up, which is a strange way to love, like walking carefully on your own floorboards. The first time she went quiet for real, she called it a reset. No fight, no scene. Just a dropped call and then nothing for 2 days. When she reappeared, it was with tenderness you couldn't fake. She brought groceries. She made me sit and drink water while she cooked. She kissed me like the end of a movie. I asked where she'd been and she said, "You always want a map." I'm here. I told myself that was enough. Sometimes we take the present tense like a painkiller and ask fewer questions until it wears off. I remember one night more clearly than most. I had a fever and texted that I might skip our plan. She replied, "Don't be dramatic." An hour later she arrived anyway with lemons and honey and the stubbornness of someone who hates losing to anything, even a virus. She made tea, pressed a cold cloth to my forehead, and then, while I dozed on the couch, she sat at the edge and scrolled her phone with a smile I didn't recognize. I woke up to her taking a photo of our hands and posting it with a caption about showing up. I thought it was sweet. I thought a lot of things were sweet that were actually for an audience I couldn't see. There were tiny mysteries I stepped around. A coat left on a chair that wasn't hers. A scent that wasn't mine. A new song she looped that didn't sound like anything she ever liked. She explained each thing easily, borrowed, spilled, discovered, and every explanation landed just soft enough to dull the thought that maybe I should dig. "Trust me," she'd say, and the way she said it made the word feel heavy and expensive, like something I couldn't afford to question. She told stories about loyalty like they were myths she'd personally verified. "People are conditional," she said, "until you find someone who isn't." I said I could be that someone and meant it. She kissed me like I'd answered correctly. Later, when she was late again and I joked about stealing her calendar, she looked at me for a beat too long and said, "You wouldn't like everything you saw." I laughed because the alternative was asking what she meant and standing there waiting for an answer that would shape the rest of my life. We had a ritual after long days, 2 glasses, the cheap wine we pretended was better than it was, our legs tangled on the couch while we narrated headlines to each other in voices that made the world sound dumber and safer than it is. She'd lay her head on my chest and ask me about the scar on my hand or the worst haircut I ever had or what I wanted at 12 that I never admitted. That's how intimacy tricked me, not with grand confessions, but with small, specific questions that made me feel seen. I didn't notice how often those answers later returned as material, stories told at dinners, captions tweaked for sympathy, inside jokes repeated to strangers until they weren't inside anymore. If you're reading this to find the exact moment I lost the plot, I can't give it to you. It wasn't a cliff, it was a slope. I kept telling myself gravity was romance. I kept calling confusion mystery because mystery sounds prettier. I kept saying love is work so often I forgot work is also work, and it should not be swallowing you whole in the name of poetry. There was a morning when my best friend said, "You look tired," and I answered, "We're just busy," which is the kind of sentence you say when you've stopped counting the ways you're not okay. That night she didn't come over. She sent a photo instead, a blurry table, a drink with a nail-polished hand that wasn't hers resting near the edge. She wrote, "You'd hate this place." I typed "Where are you?" and erased it. I typed "Be safe" and sent it. I went to bed pretending be safe is a complete thought. I'm telling this in order because I want to be fair to her, but mostly to the version of me who kept choosing the gentlest explanation because it hurt less for 5 minutes at a time. I did not know the ending. I did not suspect it, not the way people like to say they always knew. I suspected ordinary things, that we would outgrow or survive, that we would fight and fix, all the boring outcomes. I didn't think about betrayal because betrayal felt like a word for other people, louder people, messier people. We were curated chaos. That seemed safer. If there's a thesis to this first part, it's only this: love can feel true while facts are quietly arranging themselves behind your back. You can be sincere and still be wrong. You can be steady and still be standing on a floor that doesn't belong to you. I didn't know that then. I just knew I wanted to be the kind of man who didn't run at the first sign of weather. I had no idea how long a storm can sit over a house and call itself home. That's where I was, before anything broke in a way you can't photograph, a man explaining away delays, collecting small kindnesses like proof, learning a script someone else was writing, and calling it us. I tried to be smarter the second act in, but smart is just another word for hope with a spreadsheet. I started collecting little facts, not to accuse her, just to keep my brain from rewriting history to protect my feelings. Dates. Times. Screenshots I never sent. A map of when she went quiet and when she came back sweet. It looked like a weather chart: storms on weekends, sunshine on Mondays. I told myself that's normal. People have lives. People get tired. People deserve privacy. I said all the reasonable things until they sounded unreasonable even in my head. Her schedule shifted like a living thing. Late edit, she'd text. Last minute meeting, industry drinks, don't wait up. When I offered to pick her up, she'd tease me, "Don't be a dad," and send a blurry photo of a bar that could have been any bar. I tried to be supportive. I tried not to be the guy who needs proof of every minute. But a new pattern crept in. She'd be unreachable for hours and then call me on the walk home, voice soft and too bright at the same time, like the energy you have after a performance. She'd talk fast, stack compliments on me like sandbags, then laugh at nothing and go sudden quiet. "You still there?" she'd ask. Always, I'd say, which was true in all the wrong ways. There were objects that didn't fit our picture. A receipt in her tote from a restaurant we joked about being too precious, with 2 entrees and a cocktail I'd never seen her order. A playlist appeared on her account called Interim, full of songs I didn't recognize, all from the same month. A toothbrush in her bathroom that matched none of mine, sitting in a travel cup even though she never traveled with a cup. She explained everything cleanly. The receipt was a team dinner. The playlist was for work brain. The toothbrush was her cousin's. You've met her, she's chaotic. I nodded at every answer because nodding is easier than being the man who cannot let a toothbrush be a toothbrush. We had a weekend that should have saved us. She booked a cabin, her idea, no service, bad kettle, a bed that creaked like it had stage fright. We hiked badly, boiled pasta that tasted like apology, and watched a storm sow itself across the sky. In that quiet, she was the version of herself that convinced me the other versions were misunderstandings. She asked me about the summer I learned to skate, the teacher who made me hate math, the first thing I ever fixed with my hands. She fell asleep on my arm and murmured "You were home" in a voice that didn't sound like someone else's lines. I wanted to believe the cabin proved something permanent. On the way back she stopped twice to check something for work, and by the time we hit the city, her phone was back to being the third person in our car. My best friend tried the gentle intervention. We were on a bench with coffee that went cold while he searched for careful words. "You're dimmer," he said finally, like he was diagnosing a bulb. "You make jokes that look behind you as they land." I said work was heavy. He raised an eyebrow. "Okay," he said, the way people say okay when they love you and don't want to push you off a cliff. I went home defensive and still heard him when I brushed my teeth. Dimmer. Jokes that look behind them. I saw myself the way you catch your reflection in a storefront at night and think, who is that trying to look like me? She suggested couples therapy in a tone that made it sound like a brand. The therapist had perfect plants and a pen that never stopped moving. We said the right sentences in the right order. I talked about wanting transparency without a police badge. She talked about wanting freedom without punishment. The therapist nodded like those were compatible goods on a shelf you could buy together if you had a coupon. On the way out, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "We're a good story," and for a stupid second I felt proud, like we performed honesty well. We went for dumplings to celebrate telling the truth in a room where the truth couldn't bump into anything sharp. Little kindnesses kept resetting the clock. She'd show up at my door with coffee and a grin like she was late on purpose to make the arrival sweeter. She'd sit cross-legged on my counter and ask for a screwdriver, then fix a cabinet I'd been ignoring for months, like proof she could mend what she loosened. She bought me a jacket I'd pointed at once in a window, then told everyone I never buy myself anything nice, which was both kind and correct and somehow still made me feel like a child at his own birthday. But the gaps kept widening. She started telling stories about a creative partner with the reverence people use for saints. He was tireless. He got it. He took weight off. She said his name like a password, light in her mouth, and then laughed at herself for bringing him up again. I told myself it was work. I told myself adults collaborate. I told myself insecurity is not a virtue. When she canceled dinner for a last-minute brainstorm, I texted, "Kill it," and put my phone face down like a man choosing trust the way you choose to keep breathing. The night that didn't break anything still broke me came out of nowhere. My mom called during dinner to ask a very mom question about a stain remover. I stepped out to help, returned to the table, and found her scrolling with that smile she has for comments that say nice things about her. I said, "Sorry," and she waved it off, then showed me a photo someone had taken of us from behind. We looked like a couple in a brochure. "See," she said. "We fit." And I thought, we photographed beautifully. That's not the same as being safe. I started keeping a simple rule: ask one more question than comfort allows. When she said late, I said with who? When she said don't fuss, I said what time? When she said it's nothing, I said then tell me. The answers came smoother than lies should. Names I'd heard before, nouns that stacked convincingly, times that matched enough to quiet me. I was not looking for a gotcha. I was looking for the permission to stop looking. The clues weren't dramatic. A faint cologne on a sweater she only wore with me. A photo on her camera roll that didn't include a face, just a familiar table with a different hand half in frame. A corner of a hotel lobby I recognized from a friend's honeymoon album, not ours. Each thing alone is nothing. Together they are a chorus you pretend is wind. She asked me to come to a small show she said mattered, something she'd helped build with the partner. I went because that's what you do when you love someone who lives on stages. I clapped where the room clapped. I laughed where laughter was the right currency. I watched her glow under lights that make everyone look like the best version of themselves. After, she hugged him the way people hug when they're proud of work that cost them sleep, long enough for the room to notice, short enough to call it professional. He shook my hand, his eyes were kind. That kindness will haunt me longer than any grin. Back at her place we ate delivery on the floor. She put her feet on my thigh and said, "Are you happy?" I said, "I want to be." She said, "We're getting there," and kissed me in that careful way that says we're fixing something without naming what it is. She fell asleep and I lay there counting the seconds between her breaths and thinking if you can measure something this precise you should be able to understand it. There was a Sunday morning when she asked me to grab pastries while she showered. I came back to the bathroom fan running and music playing low, that new playlist with the unfamiliar spine. Her phone lit up on the sink with a message from a name I knew only as a handle. I didn't read it. I stared at the lock screen like it had asked me a question and I'd refused to answer. When she came out in a towel, she smiled like a promise and said, "You're good," as if I'd passed a test by not doing what I could have done. Later I realized a test you don't know you're taking is still a test someone is scoring. Work got worse for me right when her world looked better. I missed a deadline I wouldn't have missed 6 months earlier. My boss asked if I needed time off in the voice people use when they're worried you might explode or vanish. I said I was fine and meant it the way a man means fine when he's underwater and has learned to breathe in sips. She texted me a selfie from a rooftop at golden hour. We signed it. Big. I typed proud of you and hit send before I could let resentment test the sentence for weaknesses. The last scene of this part didn't scream. It was a Tuesday again, because apparently that day has a contract for subtle disasters. She came over with wine and the jacket I liked and a list of plans that all started with we. We cooked, bad as always, and laughed like people in a commercial for kitchen knives. My phone buzzed on the counter with my brother's name. He wanted help moving a thing the next day. She glanced at the screen and said, "You're always available for everyone else." It came out light, almost a compliment, and still hit like an accusation. I said, "I try." She said, "Try for me," and kissed me, and my brain filed that moment under proof while my body registered a scent that wasn't mine. I wish I could give you the revelation here, the clean line where knowing arrives and everything rearranges. It didn't. I went to sleep next to a woman I loved and woke up in the same place, in the same uncertainty, with the same list of small questions I kept putting in a drawer. She made coffee and hummed and told me she had an early touch base and asked what I needed from the store. I said nothing, which wasn't true, and watched her leave carrying a bag with a book we joked about never reading. The door clicked. The apartment exhaled. I stood in my own kitchen and thought, if love is this much arithmetic, why do I still feel like I'm failing the test? I didn't know the end yet. I didn't even know the middle properly. I only knew I was tired in a way sleep doesn't fix, and that the person I told everything to was the same person I couldn't ask the one question that would matter. So I did what cowards and lovers do in equal measure. I told myself tomorrow I'd be braver. And then I went to work and pretended to be a man who wasn't busy making room in his life for an answer he already feared. She started to live in two versions at once, the woman I thought I knew and the one I kept catching glimpses of through cracks she didn't patch carefully enough. Her phone was always face down, notifications silenced, excuses polished. Work chat, she'd say if it buzzed late. Campaign details, if it lit up on Sundays. I wanted to believe her, so I did. But then there were the slips, a smile too private at a message she wouldn't share, laughter out of place when I asked what was funny. Once, she left her laptop open while making tea, and I saw a name in her inbox that she'd mentioned before, always with reverence, that creative partner. The subject line said last night. She snapped it shut so fast you'd think I'd caught fire. I confronted her lightly, almost playfully, you two seem close. She kissed me hard, too hard, and whispered, you worry too much. I let that be an answer, even though it wasn't. Nights with her still had their magic. She'd sit on my chest, fingers tracing old scars, asking about childhood stories no one else cared about. She told me I was her anchor, her only calm. I believed her because I wanted to. But every time she disappeared for hours, I remembered those words and felt like a fool. Anchors don't get left behind at shore. My friends noticed before I did. One asked if I was sleeping enough, said I looked drained. Another joked that I'd become her assistant more than her boyfriend. I laughed it off, but inside, the words hit like truth I'd been avoiding. I told myself I'd wait for proof. That's what reasonable people do. But proof is slow, and while you wait, your soul shrinks. The truth was already in front of me, I just couldn't name it. I didn't know then that betrayal isn't always a single blow. Sometimes it's a shadow that grows behind you, stretching longer each day until you finally turn around and see it was always there. I kept telling myself I'd know the difference between worry and warning if it ever mattered. That's the lie you tell when you're afraid of what your own eyes can see. It started with the hotel key card that wasn't ours. Not a whole key card, just the sleeve, wedged in the pocket of a coat she'd left over the back of my chair. I found it when I went to hang it properly. White cardboard, a logo in gold I recognized from ads on the subway. No name, just a date stamped on the back from a weeknight we hadn't spent together. I turned it over twice, put it back exactly where I found it, and then stood in my own hallway arguing with myself. Team event. Lobby bathroom. Someone stuck it in her hand as a joke. All plausible. Plausible is a soft word that lets you sleep. That weekend she suggested we cook at her place. She was bright in that way a person gets after they've already spent all their dimness somewhere you can't see. While the pasta boiled, she told me a story about a client who didn't understand scope, and she acted out both parts, the righteous version of her and the cartoon idiot version of them, and I laughed on cue and tried not to imagine a third part, the one she was when I wasn't there. When I went to grab plates from the cabinet, a second toothbrush fell from a cup and tapped the sink. not a cousin's. Newer than mine. I picked it up like evidence and put it back like I wanted to be innocent. She caught me looking and kissed me mid-thought. She is very good at kissing thoughts out of my head. Stay, she said into my mouth, and if you haven't been loved like that, I don't know how to explain the way your spine votes yes even when your brain is trying to call a recount. We stayed. We cooked badly. We ate on the floor. She slept across me like a promise that had never been broken. Monday brought ordinary life back like a tide. Work. Emails. A meeting where I said the same sentence 3 different ways to sound decisive. At lunch I scrolled without scrolling. Her story showed coffee, a laptop, a caption about grind. A song played under it, one from the mysterious playlist I'd seen on her phone, and for reasons I couldn't explain it made my hands sweat. I put my phone face down and ate standing up at the counter like a man avoiding his own kitchen table. My best friend tried again, gentler than I deserved. He asked about the hotel key card without naming it, because he'd seen it when he came by for the game. Could be anything, he said, and I nodded too fast. Could be, I repeated, like 2 words can hold a house up. He looked at me the way you look at someone carrying something you can't lift for them. If you need out, I'll help, he said, and I nearly laughed because out of what? I didn't have the noun yet. You can feel trapped without the name for the cage. A small thing gave me a big feeling, her perfume changed. Not entirely, same brand, different note. Less floral, more metal. I smelled it on my collar after we hugged in her doorway and couldn't get it out of my head. New bottle? Borrowed? Shared? I heard myself and hated myself and still I could not unsmell it. I washed the shirt twice and it lingered like a sentence that doesn't end. She was on a run of late nights, each one with a reason. A launch. A reshoot. A friend who needed air. When I offered to swing by and walk her home, she said that would make her life smaller, and I said I didn't want that, and we both pretended the conversation meant something beautiful. After midnight she called from sidewalks, her voice airy the way it gets when she's been performing. Tell me something true, she'd say, and I'd give her some harmless piece of myself, the name of my 3rd grade teacher, the first album I bought with my own money, the stupid story about breaking my wrist on a skateboard I wasn't good enough for. She'd hum like I'd fed her and then say, "You're my safe," and I would forgive her absence like a priest in an empty church. There was a Thursday I can't clean out of my mind. We had plans to meet after her brainstorm. I got to the bar early because that's who I am, a person who arrives before the rest of his life does. 2 seats down sat her creative partner, the one with the kind eyes from the show, flipping through photos on his phone, the blur of their work. He didn't see me. He lifted the phone, smiled to himself, kissed his thumb, tapped the screen. It was nothing and it was everything. My drink arrived. I didn't touch it. He looked up, finally saw me, did a small wave like we were co-workers in different departments. I waved back and my hand felt like it belonged to someone trying to make a bridge out of air. She was 40 minutes late and arrived hurricane cheerful. She threw her arm around my neck, kissed me in a way that announced us to the room, and said, "Don't be mad," which is what you say when you know you should be asked for more than patience. I said I wasn't. She ordered what I would have ordered for her and made a joke about how well we know each other. The partner paid his bill and tapped her shoulder on the way out. She flinched only in the eyes. He said, "See you," like a man saying a sentence to 2 people without naming either. She said, "Kill it," and didn't introduce us. He nodded toward me and left, and I drank something bitter that wasn't in my glass. I asked the question badly in the walk home because I don't have the skill for good questions when I'm scared. Is there something I should know? She laughed in that way that turns an accusation into a compliment about her charisma. I'm complicated, she said, like the word was a perfume. You knew that? I said knowing and living are different. She touched my face, soft, theatrical, the way you quiet a dog during fireworks. Do you trust me? She asked. It's obscene how many problems get postponed by those 4 words. Yes, I said, and felt the lie in my throat like a stone I'd chosen to swallow. I tried a different tactic, time with her that had no lenses. A stupid road trip to nowhere, a diner with cracked vinyl, a day spent buying nothing we needed. She was radiant in boredom for almost 5 hours. We made up names for strangers. We argued about the best fries shape like it mattered to anyone else. Then her phone raised its hand and the spell broke. She took 3 calls in the parking lot, paced circles into the oil stains, came back with apologies she said so often they have grooves. I'm not leading you, she said. I just need 15 minutes. It was 40. The waitress brought pie on the house because she thought I'd been stood up. I left a tip too big and a smile too small and drove home talking about the weather like a man trying to keep the sky from falling. The clues stopped being clues and started being logistics. A calendar invite on her laptop called hold for 3 hours in the middle of a weekday, recurring, with a location pin that looked like a hotel lobby if you zoomed far enough. A double charge at the same bar on 2 cards 15 minutes apart. A cab receipt and a jacket pocket to an address that wasn't mine and wasn't hers, and I knew exactly which corner it sat on, because I pass it on the bus and think about how nice the windows are at night. Each time I found a thing, she found a story, and each time I heard her story, I found a way to believe it because the alternative required me to be someone who left. I did leave once, for an hour. I walked out of her building and didn't take the elevator, took the stairs 2 at a time like speed could outrun certainty. On the 2nd floor a door opened and a neighbor I didn't know stepped into the hall with a dog who didn't bark. She said, "Long night," as if she'd seen mine. I said, "Just tired." She nodded like that was the right answer, and I stood there feeling like a man rehearsing lines for a play he didn't audition for. That night, in my apartment, I put all the objects on the table like a puzzle I didn't want to finish. The key card sleeve. The toothbrush in my head. The perfume with a new metal note. The cab receipt. The blurry photo of a table edge that wasn't ours. I waited for rage and got paperwork. My hands took pictures of the pictures like I needed to keep a copy of things no one had stolen. I sat until the light changed and the room got the blue honest quality of early morning, and still I could not choose a verdict. Love kept filing appeals. I called my brother because he is the only person who tells the truth without enjoying it. I told him I thought I was being stupid. He said, "Maybe." I told him I might be being lied to. He said, "Probably." I asked what to do. He said, "Ask the question you're pretending doesn't exist." I said, "If I ask it, it makes it real." He said, "It's already real." I thanked him and hung up and stared at my phone like it had teeth. I didn't ask that day. I did something smaller. I asked to see her Tuesday. She said she had a hold. I said I could come to her neighborhood, I had errands. She said she'd text me when she was free. I went anyway. I walked past the pinned location twice, felt stupid, bought a coffee, felt stupider, and then sat on a low wall pretending to reply to emails while people who weren't me lived their lives with no knowledge of mine. An hour in, I saw her from half a block away. Even from that distance I could tell which version of her she was, shoulders back, chin up, the one who looks like she owes the street money and is here to collect. She wasn't alone. He walked beside her, hands in pockets, the kind eyes doing their kind thing. They weren't touching. They didn't have to be. Their pace had a shared variable we never did on Tuesdays. They passed so close I could have said hello and chosen the kind of story we would all tell about that day. I didn't. I waited until their backs were small, and then I stood and walked the other direction, each step heavier and somehow lighter. She called me that night smiling. "You free?" she asked. I said yes, because old habits have long leashes. She came over with dessert and a story about a meeting that ran long and a joke about me not surviving without sugar. We ate bad cake and watched a show that didn't require belief. At one point she put her feet across my lap and said, "You're quiet," and I said, "I'm tired," and she said, "From what?" and I said, "From guessing," and she froze for half a second and then unfroze and said, "You think too much," and I almost laughed because that's true and also not the point at all. I wish I could tell you I confronted her like a man in a movie. I didn't. I held a plate, I loaded a dishwasher, I asked if she'd be here this weekend and she said she'd try and I said okay, and we both behaved like people in a house that hasn't noticed the roof is gone. She fell asleep on my chest and I watched a crack in the ceiling like it could answer me. Around 3 a.m. my phone buzzed on the nightstand with a message from my brother, "Still real." I put the phone face down and closed my eyes and didn't sleep. Morning made us fresh and lying again. She showered and sang, that new playlist humming from the speaker. I made coffee and 2 slices of toast she wouldn't eat, and we kissed like we both believed in a future our mouths hadn't told our eyes about. At the door she said, "Text me," and I said, "Always," and she said, "You're good," and I said, "You too," and she left carrying a tote that looked heavier than yesterday. Here's where I ended up, at the end of this long, quiet unraveling. I still didn't know in the way that silences a room, but I knew in the way that stains a shirt. You can wash and people won't see it from across the street, but you do, every time you look down. The betrayal hadn't arrived like a blow, it had taken up residence like damp. Maybe nothing happened in the way I'd punish. Maybe everything did. The part that mattered was already broken. I had become a man who studied his life from the doorway, who cataloged evidence he refused to present, who loved someone and could not stand to know where she was on a Tuesday. I told myself, again, that tomorrow I'd be braver. I would ask and survive the answer. I would choose a truth even if it took me apart. Then I put on my jacket and went to work and made coffee in a break room with bad lighting and answered emails and performed competence and thought about the hotel key card sleeve sitting in my drawer like a sentence no one had the courage to read out loud. I didn't need the big reveal anymore. The truth had been dripping into me one small piece at a time until I was soaked in it. I never caught her in the act, no scene, no confrontation, no dramatic confession. Just little objects that were mine, smells that didn't belong, silences that lasted too long. She never admitted anything, and I never asked the final question. Maybe that's why it still haunts me. I carried the love like a bandage, even when I knew it was already bleeding through. I told myself she was complicated, that trust meant patience, that loyalty meant waiting. But what I was really doing was protecting myself from the collapse that would come if I said it out loud. So I left quietly. No fight, no speech, no justice. Just one morning where I decided I couldn't keep collecting pieces of a puzzle I was afraid to finish. I walked away with doubt in my pocket, pain in my chest, and the memory of a woman who played both the cure and the poison. And that's how my story ends, not with answers, but with the courage to stop needing them.